Hey everybody, this is Kayla here. You are in the middle of Antibody Identification Week, and I believe Tuesday is Antibody ID Film Festival, so I can't tell you how excited I am for this week. This is what people have been telling me about antibody when I talk about antibodies, and it's true. I just love them. And so we're going to go over the new Antibody ID SOP. This video is going to be about the Antibody Identification Guide specifically. And then there are subsequent videos going over the warm autoantibody SOP and the cold reactive antibody SOP. So let's get started. I'm going to pull the SOP up here. Okay, you guys probably heard me drinking coffee. All right. So the procedure is updated to reflect the current methodology. So we're talking about the vision using automated gel as our primary method for antibody identification, and then using tube methods with or without potentiating sera to problem solve. The procedure is formatted and so in a way that kind of walks you through performing a panel and then evaluating it, and all the little pieces you need to get to an antibody identification. So the first part just talks about what a panel is, and I'll skip right over it because I know you guys all know what it is, but it's just to get us on the same playing field. And then the next really important section talks about evaluating the autocontrol. So I want us to start looking at, is the auto positive or negative? And then what does that mean? So thinking about, do I have an alloantibody or an autoantibody? Could I have a delayed serological transfusion reaction? Or do I have like a warm or a cold autoantibody? Could this be from drugs? The procedure references the DAT tube or polyspecific SOP, so feel free to, if your auto is positive, follow that SOP as far as it can take you, and then come back to the antibody ID procedure to guide you a little bit more. And you'll see how that works once we go through it. The next section is on performing rule-outs. I know you all know how to do this. Please go back and read it and refresh yourself. I think one of the things that I see commonly is for patients where Rh immune globulin is not suspected, including OB patients, Rh antigens must be eliminated with 1 double dose or homozygous cell or 2 single dose or heterozygous cells. So just, update and refresh a little bit now that this procedure is out. The second section after that is evaluating reaction strengths and patterns. And this is my favorite section. This section took me forever to come up with an algorithm for you all to make it a little bit easier. And so how it works is you look at the column on the left and there are color-coded boxes. And you will try to find the box that fits with your pattern of reactivity. So you'll see it has some cells positive, some are all cells positive, and most are all cells positive, one or only a few red cells reactive. And it talks about the strengths and reactivity in the different phases. When you find the right box, you're going to look over to the arrow and it's going to talk about what you might suspect. So single antibody, multiple antibodies showing dosage, warm autoantibody, etc. And then that box on the right-hand side talks about what you should do next. So evaluate patterns and ensure rule of 2 is met. Or maybe it means refer to this section of the SOP. So essentially it'll say you're here, you're thinking this, and you should go here now. Really excited about it. You'll also notice it's broken up into 2 sections. So antibody identification with a negative autocontrol or DAT, and then with a positive autocontrol, and then with subsequent positive monospecific reagents, so IgG versus C3. This is also the section that if you are suspecting a warm autoantibody or a cold antibody, you're going to jump out of this procedure and into the warm auto SOP or the cold SOP. When I was creating it, it made sense to make them separate because there's so much work that goes into identifying those specific antibodies, including computer entry, etc. So that's when you'll be jumping to the new procedures in the subsequent videos that you'll watch. The next section talks about ensuring the rule of 2 is met. We all know what the rule of 2 is, just refresh yourself in this section. One thing I do want to point out is that we've had different ways to ensure that our outdated panel cells can be used for rule outs. So we know we always need a positive control, and we want to make sure that the antigens that we're using to test with patient plasma or serum are intact. We don't want to be testing with the antigen that has disintegrated, because then we don't really know if the reactivity is true or not. And so this procedure tries to standardize, and it says to follow the miscellaneous antigen typing procedure. Essentially what that means is you're going to be antigen typing the antigen that you're interested in on your expired panel. I know this can be hard with 0.8 cell suspensions, so I encourage you to use the panel cell 20 or 10 when you can. If this becomes a problem, please let me know. Kathy and I did do a little experiment, and she antigen typed some Duffy antigens on the panel cell 20s for me. We only had panels that were about 3 or 4 months old, so we weren't able to get out to maybe 6 months, which is what we would want to see maybe for ideal storage, to be able to use those really amazing rare phenotypes on the cells that we save, but that's promising. So I'm thinking once those panels get old enough, we can validate out to a certain time frame, and then if the panel is in the proper storage through that time, we may not need to be antigen typing anymore. We may have validated it. So stay tuned. There is hope. The next section is on phenotyping patients for corresponding antigens. We talk about not phenotyping if they've been recently transfused in the last 90 days. However, I do include a clause to say if it's going to help in antibody identification and they've been recently transfused. In some cases, it may be okay to perform that antigen typing. You just need to make sure you're evaluating your results properly, which means looking very carefully for mixed field populations, evaluating major and minor populations. And so if you're going to do this, consult with a specialist or a lead or a buddy, and we can talk about if these results make sense, and then determine if we can even consider it valid or enter it into the computer. So take caution. The next section is on antibody identification with limited specimen. I know there's always been some questions about what exactly is required, and so I've laid them out here in this section, and I think you guys can read and let me know if you have questions. The next section is dealing with patients with antibodies previously identified at non-mHealth or Fairview sites. So this has always been a question, do we need to do our own work? How do we handle the specimen? And it is laid out here in the procedure, talking about ensuring the rule of 2 is met, etc. The one thing that we did add here that I think is going to really beef up our operations is we are asking that we request a physical copy of the results or antibody ID, whatever the workup was, from the hospital that we're calling. And I think this is just going to help us make sure that we are entering information correctly into the BAD file, because we do need to be honoring all antibody history from outside labs. And so most labs will do this for you. They may request a special written request on a letterhead from Fairview. We do keep letterhead by the fax machine, so just ask a supervisor, specialist to get that for you if you need it, and usually they're more than happy to fax it over once you make a formal request, and you are empowered to do that. All right, so getting more into the meat. The next section is antibodies to low incidence antigens. So I will say there are 2 sections. There's antibodies to low incidence antigens. There is antibodies to high incidence antigens. You all know that at UMMC, we see a lot of what we like to call unidentified antibodies. We need a way to categorize these to be safe for our patients. So I looked at a lot of workups, talked to a lot of people in the bank, and what we've seen is it's usually safe to call something antibody to a low incidence antigen, or potentially a UID, if it reacts with less than 50% of cells tested. Because at this point, we're usually able to find compatible cross matches. We don't have a hard time ruling out antibodies. And so we have defined a low incidence antibodies react with less than 50% of all cells tested. Once the antibody reacts with equal to or greater than 50% of all cells tested, we want to refer to the antibodies to high incidence antigen section of the procedure to continue our ID. And the reason for this is once antibodies become too difficult to identify or rule out antibodies, or cross matches become difficult, we want to send that to Red Cross or our reference lab just to make sure that we're being safe. We have had antibodies reacting with 70 or 100% of cells tested, and then we realize, oh, it's a McCoy, or multiple antibodies that we didn't think about. So this is just for patient safety. So go through the low incidence antibody section. When you think of antibodies to low incidence antigens, one antibody you may think of right away is anti-CW. And this is the prime example to remind ourselves that antibodies to low incidence antigens, or UIDs, aren't always clinically insignificant. Anti-CW is clinically significant, so they do matter. So I do go through how to define a low incidence antibody to low incidence antigen, some criteria for when you should suspect that antibody, and then how to go about identifying one. And so one of the major culture shifts I think we need to make or to enforce is that we need to be checking patient history for clues to help us to identify antibody specificity. Some antibodies are more common in some populations. For example, pregnant women, they often have anti-BG antibodies due to having multiple pregnancies, being multiparous. And that's going to help you when you've got a UID that has no pattern, and then you look at the panel cells and it's like, they're all BG positive. So this is very important and can be very applicable when you're looking at patient history and diagnosis. And I'm going to have an EPIC work aid for you to help you look in EPIC, but also in the blood bank LAS. Then the procedure does go on to define that if reactions are observed with less than or equal to 2 cells total, including screen and panel, and all other allo antibodies have been ruled in or out, that we can go ahead and result as UID. If there are greater than 2 cells reacting total, including screen and panel, we do need to run another panel to try to show specificity, so keep that in mind. I do give examples of common antibodies to low incidence antigens that we might observe, and we could specify at UMMC, including BG antigens, CW, or the anti-KPA. And then I go on to define cross matches, and if the reactivity is less than 50%, compatible cross matches should be obtainable. If they become hard, consult with a specialist or blood bank medical doctor, depending on the urgency of the situation, and we might need to send out to Red Cross or really think about what's happening with the patient clinically. And then it does talk about how to enter information into the BAD file, and then refers you to some computer entry information. And then I go on to talk about anti-CW, anti-BG, and anti-KPA in depth, so you can feel more confident in resulting those low incidence antibodies. The next section that's going to help you determine if you've got a true antibody to a high incidence antigen or cold antibody that's panreactive with maybe a negative DAT, or antibodies to preservative in the reagent red cells is the panreactive antibodies with negative autocontrol section. Super fancy. And so for this, I like to say that we're going to perform a differential antibody diagnosis to distinguish a particular antibody from other antibodies that present with similar reactions. So I go on to talk about, what an antibody to high incidence antigen profile might look like. For example, think about anti-Cheeto Rogers or a leukocyte antibody. That's kind of my gold standard that I'm thinking of. Cold antibodies, think about the reactions in gel, in tube, think about your DAT, your cross matches. Antibodies to preservative and reagent red cells, your auto, maybe reactions in gel cross matches, maybe tube screens or cross matches repeated with washed, gel screen repeated with washed cells. That's going to help you determine what to do. And I do go into some testing that you can consider to help rule in or out some of these antibodies. So I'm hoping that's helpful. So that's kind of a new addition to this procedure that goes more in depth instead of kind of leave you wondering what I should do in these certain situations. And then the next section is antibodies to high incidence antigens. So again, antibodies that react with greater than 50% of cells, and or compatibility testing has become very difficult. In this section, I talk about, what some of the common antibodies to high incidence antigens are. Think about your confidence seer from last year, the one that reacted with pretty much all cells tested, anti-FY3, I think, was the antibody. That's totally in here, super fun. And we talk about even like the Chelano Lutheran antibodies, or anti-U, and of course Cheeto Rogers here. And so this section, it can be more complicated to identify things because we don't have a lot of rare cells laying around. You can look at the back of the panel of the original panel phenotype sheet that comes with panel cell 10 or 20, and those are going to give you extended phenotypes for some of these more common high incidence antibodies. Super fun and cool if you can say, oh, yep, they're all McCoy positive. And then this section also says sometimes we can't identify these antibodies, and so they have to go to the reference lab. So I give you some criteria for when we should probably stop doing ID and when we need to start sending it out. Okay, and then we're getting to the end. So the last part is antibody clinical significance. I go in to define what a clinically significant antibody is, and also what we consider insignificant. And I'll point out that clinically insignificant antibodies are those that do not react at 37 or AHD. However, if clinically insignificant antibodies are detected at 37 and AHD, they are considered significant while reactive in those phases. So thinking about like an anti-M, oftentimes we find that it's a nuisance antibody, but it can have IgG warm reactive components that might be reacting in our gel AHD, and in that case, we do want to make sure we cross-match for compatible or find antigen-negative cells. So I lay that all out, what to do for clinically insignificant antibodies once they're no longer reacting in 37 or AHD. What kind of cross-match is okay? So go over that in the procedure. Let me know if you have questions. And then I do have a table listing clinically significant, usually insignificant, clinically significant if insignificant if not reactive at 37, but possibly significant when reacting at 37, and sometimes clinically significant. And some of these more rare antibodies that you might be asking yourself, what is YTA or what is SDA? We do see some of these antibodies at UMMC. And if you can remember even, I think I read about that somewhere, that's good enough. And we can start to go down the right path and make sure we know we have a plan for what to do for those patients. And then the last section talks about results and how to make sure that you have complete documentation. And then it has a comprehensible computer entry section discussing, entering your ABI, your BBCNCs, your BBCs, your DATs, LUs, etc. It talks about updating the BAD file, like what comments to enter for compatibility testing so that we can standardize those comments so we're not all writing random things. So look in those sections, and I've even laid out specific examples like anti-CW, or what do you do for a UID, or anti-D reacting probably due to prenatal Rh immune globulin. And then lastly, what I'm really excited and happy about is I did include cross-matching or compatibility testing for our performance when we do it at UMMC in a parallel method, so say gel or saline or gel or LIS, or if we have to send to Red Cross and we're doing a gel cross-match and then they're doing a cross-match with absorbed serum. I know that was only in a worksheet, so now it's in a physical procedure in one location. That is the antibody ID procedure in a nutshell. I know that is a lot of information, so that's why I created the video. Sorry it became super long, but I think once you go through it, you'll really enjoy it. And I think it's going to be a great training tool for our new employees and for students, because I think the old procedure made a lot of assumptions like that we should all know all of these things. And this procedure kind of takes that into account and says, let's all get on the same page and kind of find a standard method for working on antibodies and having enthusiasm. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I look forward to talking to you in person and gathering your feedback.